Hi, everybody. You already learned yesterday about how to determine whether or not a quadrilateral was a parallelogram by using slopes to determine whether its opposite sides are parallel. Let's use another property about parallelograms that we learned to help us determine whether or not quadrilaterals are parallelograms. Do you remember what diagonals are? If you have a quadrilateral, a diagonal is a segment that connects one endpoint, one vertex, to its opposite vertex. And if you remember what we learned about diagonals of a parallelogram, we actually proved that they bisect each other. So, how can we put that to work on a coordinate plane? Well, let's try the same couple of examples that we looked at yesterday, but let's use our new method to determine whether or not these quadrilaterals are parallelograms. So, the first one that we looked at yesterday was on a graph. Well, how would I check to see whether AC and BD bisect each other? Well, I could find the midpoint of AC and then the midpoint of BD. And if that midpoint is the same, then the diagonals bisect each other. So first, let's find the midpoint of AC. So let's see what these coordinates are. A is at 2, -1, and C is at 6, 5. So I can kind of eyeball the midpoint and see that it looks like it's at about 4, 2. But let's actually calculate it and make sure. So remember that when we calculate a midpoint, we want to take the average of the x coordinates and then take the average of the y coordinates. And that will give us the x and y coordinates that are in the middle of points A and C. So we'll average the 2 and the 6 by adding them up and dividing by 2. And then we'll average the -1 and the 5 by adding them up and dividing by 2. And that gives us a midpoint of 8 divided by 2 is 4 for the x coordinate, and 4 divided by 2 is 2 for the y coordinate. And yep, that looks like the midpoint that was on my graph. So the next thing that we need to check is what's the midpoint of BD. So let's see, the coordinates of B are 1, 3, and the coordinates of D are 7, 1. And let's do the same thing. We'll average them by adding up the x's and dividing by 2, and then averaging the y's by adding them up and dividing by 2. And we get a midpoint of 8 divided by 2 is 4 for the x coordinate, and 4 divided by 2 is 2 for the y coordinate. Are the midpoints the same? Yes, they are. So the diagonals bisect each other. Some people find this to be a quicker method than having to calculate 4 slopes. So yes, because the diagonals bisect each other. This might not seem like a quicker method on a graph where you could easily count to find the slopes, but you might find that it's a quicker method when you're just given coordinates and you're not given a graph. So one thing that I think is tricky is sometimes I think it's hard to figure out which points you actually are trying to find the midpoint of. So I like to make a quick sketch. I don't do this accurately or anything. I just like to put E, F, G, H on a quadrilateral, and that helps me realize that I want the midpoint of EG and the midpoint of FH. If I don't draw a sketch, sometimes I don't know what segments I should look at. So let's do midpoint of EG first. So we're going to average the x coordinates, and then we're going to average the y coordinates, and that'll give us the midpoint of EG. So let's try it out. I'm going to add up -8 and 2 and divide by 2, and then I'm going to add up 2 and 4 and divide by 2. And that will give me -6 divided by 2 is -3, and then 6 divided by 2 is 3. So that's my midpoint of EG. Let's try to do the exact same thing to find the midpoint of FH. I'm going to take the x coordinates, -4 and -2. I'm going to add them up and divide by 2. Then I'm going to take the y coordinates of 5 and 1, add them up and divide by 2. -6 divided by 2 is -3, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. So do the diagonals have the same midpoint? Yes, they do. So is this quadrilateral a parallelogram? Yes, because diagonals bisect each other. Now you have 2 methods to choose from, and you can decide which method you like best. So let's do some practice. And then on Thursday's quiz, you can decide which method it is that you want to use. Thanks for watching. Bye.